thank you very much. Thanks for your introduction. Yeah, I've kind of semi-retirement, I'm kind of call it. My wife says you won't stop working, but we'll get through that part. So yeah, I started up another little company and to do things like this, things for the pork industry. I've got a few farms I'm working with. And so I'm just kind of excited to do some things I want to do and maybe do some things that's going to help continue to grow the industry and help improvement. So yeah, I want to spend a little time on probably one of my favorite topics, unfortunately, sow death loss. And it's something that's become an industry issue. It's growing and growing. I just hope down the road we won't have some issues with more of the animal welfare and rights people about what we're doing or not doing. So I want to spend
Ron,
go ahead.
As you get started, we're going to launch our first poll question to the attendees.
Okay. I'll give you a minute or so to think about it. I put in there today just some trend lines. It's from SMS, and we had 16 years of trend lines on pigs weaned per mated female per year. Remember, our benchmarking database started back in 2005. We had about 125,000 sows in that first year, and most animal lately it's been about 1.8 million. Those would be sows U.S. There's some from Canada, and a small sampling set that's from Australia. So just to look at that, in this table I put up there, you've seen a nice increase across the last 16 years. The red line represents all farms. They started out about 21 pigs, and they ended up in 2020 at 26.4 pigs. So a gain of over 5 pigs in 16 years. Now, the top 10%, that changes pretty much every day, but when we use the numbers, we started out about 25 pigs, and they ended up a little over 32 pigs in 2020. So you got a little over 7 pig gain in that top 10% over that period of time. You see it gyrates a little bit. Back in 2018, early 2019, you saw the top end farms, which is interesting, that top 10%, they kind of had a little glitch in there, and we saw it drop a little bit, but it's came back recently. I think the thing that intrigues me is the huge variation or distribution we see in the database, from farms that are less than 18 pigs weaned per mated female per year to farms that are over 34. And I just cannot understand how that biological variation can be that much. I also put in there, looking at from August 30th of 21, looking at the SMS database, top 10% farms are about a little over 32 pigs. The farms represented the bottom 30%, or that 70 to 90 quadrant there, was 22.28. So just a little under 10 pigs difference between the top 10% and the bottom 30%. When we looked at sow death loss, next slide. Oop. One more. I'm ahead of you. Next slide, please. Okay, when we look at sow death loss, we've seen, this runs back, we got 15 years of data there. Again, the red represents the all farms, and the purple represents the top 10% farms. And as you can see, starting back in 2006, the all farms are a little over 9%. They did a very good job for several years there, up until about the 2011, to drop that number to about 7%. I think if we think back, that's the time we started talking about PQA certifications. We had more things involving our people being certified and understanding animal flows. They all floated around for several years, staying below 8%. But starting in about 2016, you'll notice the number starts to rise and ended up in 2020 at 10.8%. Even top 10% farm had some issues. They moved up to about 8% back in 2009. They drove down to less than 6% there for several years. But again, about 2016, that number started going up, and it got as high as 8.4% in 2020. So the death loss is not necessarily relative to the farms. Even the more well-managed farms, we would think at the higher production numbers, would have less problem. On the next slide, you'll see the distribution. There are farms that's less than, back up one, please. There are farms less than 2% death loss to farms over 22% sow death loss for a year. This will be the last 52 weeks. If you look at top 10% farms, they're at 8.7%. That bottom 30% farm with that 70 to 100% piece there, they're at 12.3. So the lower producing farms are seeing higher death loss than the better producing farms. Next slide. So we asked the question at the beginning, what is the value of a dead sow? A few years ago, people started asking, what do you think the value of a dead sow is? So I sat down, did some calculating, and came up with some numbers to work with. I'll take a second while you look at the polling. So in my numbers, I put in the cost of a developing gilt. I used conservative numbers. That was the price of the gilt and her development to breeding, $320. There was feed cost involved. I took it as of 1 litter, about 1,000 pounds of feed. I used $270. I know that's cheap for feed today. So $129. Vaccination cost $5. Lost litter of pigs. When we look at most of the death loss, most of the time you're losing animals that are bred, and especially in late-term gestation or during the farrowing process. So I made an assumption that in a lot of cases we lost 11 pigs, and I valued them at $35. That's probably 25 under what today or 30 is. Then also I put the cull value in. I only used 450 pounds. I used, previous to this last 2 years, I used the average of the last few years at $35 a hundredweight, $157. So I come up a little under $1,000. If I adjusted that for the price of weaned pigs today, the value of cull sows and feed costs, it'd be well over $1,500. So it's a lot of cost. And that does not include some of the other things I listed there, like the labor to remove dead animals to disposal, increased disposal costs, increased replacement cost, extra stress on the labor, increased cost of vaccinations and feed. And you can probably list many other things there that are costs that are hidden that we don't even think about. So it's a large number every time that guy is taking a dead animal out to the disposal area. Next slide. I also put in another little chart just I did a while back. I looked at my number is for about a 1% change in sow death loss. It's about a quarter of a pig more weaned or less weaned per sow per year. So I just made a model up. I had 1,000 sow inventory, weaned in 1152. So that group at 28 pigs weaned 28,000 pigs a year. I put in their cost at 30 cents. When you do the math, and for each 1% change there, you'll notice if we have a 7% change in the sow death loss, we increased our cost per pig by up to $32 or a $2 gain. So it's about 27 to 30 cents each time, each percent increase the cost of each pig. So again, it's costing you a lot of money, even though you don't think about it. But that's the cost in that's the increased cost to raise a pig. Next slide, please. And then what's going on to cause this increase? And I listed several things there, but a lack of quality labor in farms for doing the basic cleaning and repairs. Again, it's hard to find people today that show up every day, not seeing every female on the farm every day. Feed quality issues and the impact of mycotoxin. We don't even understand the effect of mycotoxins on nutrition. Expansion of U.S. industry affecting swine gilt selection. Today, there's been lots of farms, genetic companies that have lost farms to health issues. The availability of gilts is tight, and we just go a little bit deeper. We'll make her work, but we got to watch that. Not investing in and staffing on-site gilt development. With the last few years, the change in the health status, the different diseases we're dealing with, unless you get those animals on farm at an early age and you develop them, you got a problem. Health issues cause the periods of time when not bringing enough gilts, like after a PRRS break, or increased feet, leg, and dew-call injuries. Minimal research on flooring type for housing sows and pens. We didn't research too much before we started putting them in pens. And the last one, not understanding the financial impact of sows, injuries, and early culling. Do you really know the cost of a dead animal? Next slide. I put this in just to show you the impact, again, looking at numbers. There's a large number of farms across the bottom there. I think it's 588. And looking at the red line is pigs weaned per mated female per year. And you can see the black line's a trend line. So as sow death loss goes up, pigs weaned per mated female goes down. Or the other way, if we decrease sow death loss, pigs weaned per mated female goes up. However, though, look at that blue line. That's the individual farms. And look at the chatter there. the huge variation from farm to farm in sow death loss. Next slide. As I've looked at data, and you know, we did a lot of write-up of farms, so I got to look at a lot of individual farms on a pretty regular basis. In the last few years, we saw some switching, more culling and death loss of the younger parity sows. So this was put together a couple years ago, and you can see in there the blue represents sow culling, the orange represents sow death loss. And you can see on culling for the first three parities, zeros, ones, and twos, that over 40% of the younger parities were culled. And you see the sow death loss, 47% of the P zeros, ones, and twos were culled. So again, this huge shift the last few years of the younger animals being culled early and younger animals dying is definitely a bad trend line and something we got to get more into. Next slide. Also, reasons for animals being culled and died. I think this is probably an area that I've always had issues with when we looked at sows, looked at records. We've seen farms as high as 70, 75 different reasons for animals dying or being culled. And it's just darn hard to try to figure that out. So we put together a little thing here. It had 3 farms, 17 farms for 3 years. We looked at it. If you look at the blue is the death loss. When we looked there, over 25% of the deaths were miscellaneous or unknown. We didn't know why they died. Our number 2 reason was injuries and number 3 was downers, and then 4 was farrowing difficulty. I know prolapse is on everybody's mind, but again, it's something that's visual. We see it, we take it as something we see quite often. But again, it's not one of the main reasons that we're seeing a lot of death loss. If we look at culling, again, 35% of the cullings were miscellaneous or others. We didn't know why they were culled. The number 1 reason, which should be, is age. So what do we do about that? Next slide, please. Back in 2018, I wrote an article. We talked with Chris Hostetler with the National Pork Board. We talked to Craig Stalder with Iowa State. We actually came up with some reasons or ways to standardize the reasons for culls and death loss of sows. And these were the 6 areas we promoted as the areas to look at: disease and health, performance, locomotion, reproduction, intestinal, and other. And then underneath them, we put in some individual things that we could designate being culled from. I think this industry is going to continue to struggle with sow death loss until such a time as we standardize the data so we all are playing the same way. The veterinarians and people like me that look at data, when we got all this different kinds of reasons animals die or culled, it's very hard for us to come up with any conclusions or anything. Then the other part is, with 20+% of the animals is unknown, we've got to do a better job of doing some kind of on-farm diagnostics that let us get an idea whether it was a stomach ulcer or it was a lung issue or something, so we know what area to be working on. Next slide, please. When we look at the data, we looked at 37 farms, and we looked at 30% of the sow death loss in those farms was from day 115 of gestation to day 123 after farrowing. So that area of time right before farrowing to right at is a critical time where we're seeing a high percent of the animals die. I do think it's an area that needs investigation, looking at what do we need to do that week to 2 weeks before they farrow to get the sow ready for the farrowing process. And what do we got to do while she's in the farrowing crates? Next slide. I put this one in. This is one of my favorite slides I've seen. I like to meet the young man that put this together, or old person, I don't know. But sow development sets up lifetime productivity. We just don't understand how complex everything is, the nutrition, genetics, the environment, management, health is developing of a gilt. You can see all the different areas there's of interaction that we need to have more investigation on and spend more time trying to understand. We've got to do a better job of developing these gilts and having them ready for the breeding time, the quality gilts that's got the right structures that we need to work with. So I think we've got to go back and really get more involved in this gilt development section to work on this death loss issue. Next slide. I do have a few tips here, things I think you need to be taken into consideration to help out on this. And it's just like toes, feet, toes, and leg structure. Are we doing a good job of culling unsound animals or animals that aren't going to make it past their first breeding and getting them out of the sow farm? We're trying to get animals to stick around for longevity, but if they've got some bad and uneven toes or they're post-legged at breeding time, they're not going to stick around. So I think at times we've got to put an X on some of these gals and put them on the cull truck versus keeping them. Next slide. And sow body condition. I think we probably would all not agree on what's the ideal body condition. I think there's some difference of opinion, but we all would agree that there's a huge amount of variation, especially as we went more to pen gestation with stanchions to feed them. Well, we've lost individual control of that sow during the gestation period. And I think we've got to go back and look at that a lot more often now. I do feel we need to body condition score animals at breeding, at pre-check time, and then about day 80 or 85 of gestation, and make adjustments in their feeding program to try to get them to ideal condition before farrowing. I myself, feel pretty good about visual scoring, but we won't all agree on that. I think looking at using the sow calipers that came from North Carolina, there's something you got to look at today, something that can be measurable. You may have to fine tune it to your genetics, what's ideal, what's fat, and what's under conditioned. But I think this gives us a better job, especially with different people in the farm doing body condition scoring, a lot of them unexperienced, that this is a tool that can be used to get more uniformity of body condition. Just a little trick when you're doing this at breeding time, you need to mark those points there where you did that first reading. So next time the caliper goes on that same spot as you get the next reading. But I think this is something that's got you getting in your toolbox to help on sow condition. Next slide. And a thermometer. I think a thermometer needs to be carried by everybody in the farm, especially the farrowing crew. And when those sows, the day after they farrow, need to take their temperature. If you got a rectal thermometer that reads quickly, you'll be able to take her temperature. If she's over 103 degrees, you need to be working with your veterinarian, developing a protocol to address sows with temperatures. And again, probably a huge number of that is a retained pig or an infection or something. We get her treated in the next day or so. We don't see the sow at day 4 or 5 that hasn't been eating, that we end up taking her pigs away from her and taking her out to the cull pen or euthanizing her because she had a temp right after farrowing time. So a thermometer in the pocket, something that needs to be in your farms today. Next slide. And then what about feet, legs, and dew claws? I think this is the new hot topic. It's time to pedicure sows. And as we go more and more and we get more and more on pen gestation, we're starting to see more ripped dew claws. We're seeing overgrowth of dew claws and toes. I think you've got to start to be part of your management techniques. You've got to start to being able to trim toes. I have several farms doing it. The biggest thing we trim are dew claws, especially in our pen barns. Those dew claws get caught, they rip off like the one in the picture. She gets an infection. We might get her litter out of her if she's bred, and then we end up euthanizing her because it's hard to treat something like a ripped dew claw. So if we cut those dew claws back periodically, we can keep from having that issue. And I've got one farm, we dropped sow death loss over 3% when we started routinely trimming of the feet in the sows in the farm. Next slide. And what do we do about the non-competitive female? I think when we started going to pens, I think we started to see more of these. How do we handle this gal especially when we do not have any gestation crates to work with? How do we spot her early on? Maybe she's a gilt that just didn't handle things and probably should have been culled early. We got her in her system. Where are we going to put her? How are we going to handle her? How are we going to keep her to be a productive animal? So I think that's an area we've got to work on. And I think a lot of that's in the genetics. Are we breeding animals that can go into pens? I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area as far as the attitudes of the sows, how we feed them, how we house them, to be able to try to eliminate this non-competitive female. So you watch for her, you'll see her. Next slide. What about molds and mycotoxins? As I mentioned when I started, we don't begin to know what toxins and molds are in our feed and what affects our livestock. And I think it's an area we got to do lots more work on. Just putting a binder in there may not be the ideal solution. Now, there's other contaminant sources other than the grain you bring in, whether that be bean meal or corn. You got bins. When was the last time you looked at your bulk bins inside of a flashlight? And if you find that black slimy stuff on the sidewall, that's probably mold. Again, that's going to work its way into your feed system and into your sows. When was the last time you looked down that drop tube in a gestation barn with crates and looked at what kind of gunk was on the inside of that tube? Again, that stuff can flake down, sows can eat it, and we can have an issue with mycotoxins of aborted animals or things like that that can happen. So again, an area that needs to be really looked at in more detail. Next slide. And then what about your farm crew? Caring, trained, reliable people. As we mentioned when I started, it's becoming a big issue. We just can't get enough labor, especially these barns that are isolated for biosecurity. Not a lot of people around them. How do we get people there, and how do we keep them, and how do we get them trained? I think that's a huge thing. I know that a lot of people are trying to work on that, but something we got to definitely address, because the problem is there's competition on every corner in every town for labor. So how do we respond to that? How do we get those people, keep them, and train them? Next slide. So in my conclusion here, I think some things we got to look at to help lower this female death loss. We got to have trained, skilled, long-term employees. They got to stick around more than 6 months. Control the development of gilt replacement in early age. You got to take ownership of those gilts early on, at least by 50, 60 pounds. You've got to have control of their diet, their spacing, and their everyday management to be able to develop better gilts. Do the basics every day of cleaning and sanitizing. A lot of units I've been in lately, the units are getting dirty. We don't have enough people to do that just after taking care of the basics of the sow farm. But if we get dirty pens in there and stuff, the sanitation goes down, we get more infection, it becomes a problem. Keep up with basic repair and maintenance. It's just got to be done. Make sure every female on the farm gets up and is observed every day. That's something. I have several farms now. We have a health crew. That's their job, to get sows up, make sure they're in good shape. If they need treating, they need to be treated timely for the problems that they have. We need to look at high health by making sure vaccinations, acclimatization, biosecurity policies are followed every day. And on the last one, work with quality diets that support the production level of the farm. I think a lot of times we're trying to least cost formulate, and the top end farms that are in those 28, 30, 32 pigs, they're going to need a different nutrition package than the ones that are back at 22, 24. We've got to be able to look at that and customize those nutrition packages to meet the demand of those animals raising lots of pigs. And thank you for your time and appreciation. And those of you that don't have my new email address, it's on the bottom there, so it's changing. So if you want to write that down to get a hold of me, let me know. Thank you.